Hellfire Jack, The Life and Legacy of Major General Sir John George Dartnell. Episode 3, The Zulu War. In the 1870s, Cetshwayo was king of the Zulus and was the absolute ruler of a rigidly disciplined army of 40,000 fierce warriors. That meant there were about 4 native warriors to every white person in the colony of Natal, South Africa. The Zulu warriors' immense mobility and the speed at which they could mount a surprise attack created a critical problem for the much smaller British and European population. The Dutch Boers had already fought several fierce battles with the Zulus, and most of the colonists in Natal felt that they were in the middle of a strategically unsafe position. In 1874, Sir Bartle Frere was sent from England to South Africa and appointed as the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa to find a solution for the growing problems with the Kingdom of Zululand and the increasing contentions with the Boers in the armed independent states of the South African Republic. When the High Commissioner came up with the flawed idea of annexing the British-friendly Kingdom of Zululand into a greater South African confederation by force of arms, he presumed that Zulus armed with spears, clubs, and shields would be no match for the mighty British army. The ultimatum the commissioner sent to the Zulu King included the following demands. 1. That no one living in Zululand, whether white or black, could be executed without a British trial. 2. That the Zulu army be completely disbanded and the men allowed to go home. 3. That the entire Zulu military system be discontinued. There were several other demands that were as restrictive as those above, but the real problem with the ultimatum was that Cetshwayo was given a ridiculously short amount of time to reply to these heavy mandates, and he would have been dethroned by his people if he had given in to the British. When Cetshwayo refused to yield, Sir Henry Bartle Frere appointed Major General Lord Chelmsford to lead the British Army expedition into Zululand in January 1879. The object of this military excursion was to overawe the Zulus with the military superiority of the British Army, and to hunt down and arrest the rebel Cetshwayo, king of the Zulus. In the face of this British invasion, Cetshwayo mobilized his 40,000 Zulu warriors on a scale not seen before. During the Zulu War, the Natal Mercury newspaper printed the following story about Major Dartnell and his Natal Mounted Police. There is one branch of the army that is now spreading itself over our frontiers and over Zululand, to which scant justice has been done in the records of this campaign. It is a force which to us in Natal ought to possess interest, for it represents the future army of South Africa. We refer to the Natal Mounted Police. They have played an effective and very honorable part in this imperial campaign. We have always felt it both a pleasure and a duty to uphold the reputation of Major Dartnell's force. They have earned the right to be regarded with respect and admiration. These men played the true part of soldiers at Isandlwana, where the bodies of their slain comrades lay grouped around the last rallying point of the battle because they chose to stay and fight to the bitter end. The records of the campaign show that whenever their services have been called into action, they have behaved with gallantry and distinction. This is no more than we might have expected of any corps led by Major Dartnell. We believe a more devoted and daring leader will not be found in South Africa. Whatever the Natal Mounted Police have had to do, they have done it well, and the fine fellows who have come out to join its ranks may feel pride in realizing that they belong to a force that enjoys a very special degree of appreciation from the community they serve. Our mounted police is a mobile force of men that are ready to operate at any point on short notice whenever insurrection appears, and will be our chief defense force in the future. Lord Chelmsford recognized that no one in the colony of Natal, Africa had a better reputation for understanding the natives, geography, and lay of the land in the kingdom of the Zulus than Major Dartnell, Commandant of the Natal Mounted Police. So Lord Chelmsford removed Dartnell from his command of the Natal Mounted Police and placed him on his own personal staff to lead the cavalry into Zululand to find King Cetshwayo. When the mounted police learned that Dartnell was being replaced by a British Army officer, even though they were very keen to be involved in the fight, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction about Dartnell's removal. The Natal Mounted Police were police and were not sworn soldiers of Her Majesty's service, and they knew they had the right to resign when they wanted. So they threatened to resign as a body rather than go into Zululand under anyone else but Commandant Dartnell. John Dartnell was touched by this show of loyalty, but he was also a stickler for discipline and respect for the chain of command, and he was having none of it. After his strong remonstrance with his men, they agreed to serve under one of their own Natal police officers, Inspector Mansell, while Dartnell continued to serve on the general staff. Realizing that the mounted police were irreplaceable as army scouts, Lord Chelmsford decided to put Dartnell in charge of both the cavalry and the mounted police, which caused much cheering when his troopers received the good news. The Natal Mounted Police rendered exceptional service while they were attached to the command of the army for the rest of the Zulu War. Spirits were high in January 1879 when Chelmsford and his troops left Pietermaritzburg, Natal Colony, and marched his wagon train of 4,907 well-armed soldiers, 302 wagons and carts, 1,507 oxen, and 116 horses and mules towards Rorke's Drift at the Buffalo River, which was the boundary that lay between the British and their supposed swift victory in Zululand. General Lord Chelmsford and his expeditionary forces stopped at Helpmaker, and after church parade, he addressed the Natal Mounted Police. He said in the short time they had been under his command, he had every reason to be satisfied with their conduct and appearance. He added that it would give him great pleasure to take them with him into Zululand, where they must expect to meet a foe outnumbering the British forces by 20 to 1. He spoke of the many hardships they had in store, with days and nights of constant watching and some severe fighting. But, he concluded, I feel sure you will give a good account of yourselves and sustain the high reputation which has always been attached to your corps. That such proved to be the case is a matter of history. Chelmsford divided his army into 3 columns. Colonel Evelyn Wood, a man who had received the Victoria Cross Medal, of the 90th Light Infantry, commanded the column that crossed the Buffalo River into the north of Zululand. Colonel Pearson of the 3rd Foot, the Buffs, commanded in the south by the Indian Ocean coast. Colonel Glenn of the 24th Foot commanded the center column comprising both battalions of the 24th Foot, units of the Natal Mounted Police, Natal Native Infantry, Natal Irregular Horse, and Royal Artillery. Chelmsford, Major Dartnell, and his men arrived at Rorke's Drift on January 9th with plans to cross the Buffalo River and head for Ulundi, Cetshwayo's principal kraal, that is village, joining Pearson's southern column for the final assault. Lord Chelmsford assigned Major Dartnell to go deep into enemy Zulu territory and find the Zulu King and his army. Chelmsford said he would meet up with Dartnell and their combined forces would capture Cetshwayo. A company of the 2nd Battalion 24th Foot remained at Rorke's Drift, the advanced base for the column. In the early morning of Sunday, January 11th, they began crossing the Buffalo River into the Zulu Kingdom. Then Chelmsford headed for Isandlwana Hill. Isandlwana could be seen from Rorke's Drift. It lay some 10 miles into Zulu territory and had a distinctive shape that looked like the Sphinx emblem the British soldiers wore on their uniform's collar. The soldiers' superstitious feelings of anxiety added substantially to the macabre aura that would hang over the Battle of Isandlwana. The center column carried all its supplies in ox carts, each pulled by a team of up to 20 oxen, walking at a slow, deliberate pace. A considerable part of the day was devoted to feeding and caring for the oxen. The country was hilly, scrubland, without roads, and the progress was painfully slow. Hilltops had to be picketed, and the country scouted carefully for Zulus in ambush. Movement was further hampered by heavy rain, causing the rivers and streams to swell and deepen. The center column reached Isandlwana on January 20th, 1879, where Chelmsford's forces pitched their camp on Isandlwana's lower slopes. General Chelmsford decided not to follow the normal standing orders to entrench and place their wagons in a defensive circle because Chelmsford did not want to spend the time, stating it would take a week to set up properly. But really, the chief reason was that the British command severely underestimated the Zulus' capabilities. The experience of numerous colonial wars fought in Africa had shown that massed firepower of relatively small bodies of professional European troops that were armed with modern firearms and artillery, supplemented by local allies and levies, would march out to meet the poorly armed natives who would put up a fight and then run away. Chelmsford believed that a force of over 4,000, including 2,000 British infantry armed with Martini-Henry rifles, as well as artillery and rockets, had more than sufficient firepower to overwhelm any attack by primitive Zulus armed only with spears, cowhide shields, and a few firearms such as antiquated English Brown Bess smoothbore muskets. Indeed, with a British force of this size, it was the logistical arrangements which occupied Chelmsford's thoughts, rather than any fear that the camp might be attacked. His main concern was managing the huge number of wagons and oxen required to support his forward advance. At dawn on the 21st of January, Major John Dartnell left the camp at Isandlwana and led a party of about 150 men on a reconnaissance mission, some 10 miles to the southeast in the area of the Halazakazi Hill. As they approached the Mangini River, Dartnell was involved in several skirmishes with a group of Zulus and killed about 30 warriors. Then he sent a messenger to inform General Chelmsford that they spotted a large force of several hundred Zulu warriors on the Halazakazi Heights. At first it appeared that the warriors were going to attack, but then they fell back and disappeared behind a hill. Believing that his force was not yet strong enough to counter such a sizable enemy, he decided that his patrol would spend the night watching the Zulu campfires to keep from losing sight of them, and he needed reinforcements and more supplies, including food and ammunition. Major Dartnell's camp had a very rough night, as they were disturbed by enemy movements in the night and got very little sleep. Through the darkness, Dartnell's patrol spotted more and more enemy fires to the east, and found that the Zulu force Dartnell was monitoring had significantly increased, numbering some several thousand warriors. The commander realized that it was inconceivable to attack his enemy the next morning, as such an act would be suicidal without reinforcements. Major Dartnell dispatched another courier to inform Chelmsford of the increase in activity, as well as another request for badly needed supplies. Chelmsford refused the reinforcements request, but did approve the latter, sending inadequate rations for Dartnell's force. Late in the evening of January 21st, Dartnell sent a third messenger back to Isandlwana, requesting Chelmsford to march to his patrol's aid, particularly with his British infantry regulars. The message reached the camp at 1:30 a.m. on January 22nd. Within the half hour, Chelmsford was awake. He changed his mind and ordered his men to be ready to march at daybreak. In a rash decision, Chelmsford broke the first military rule in enemy territory. He divided his force, leaving 1,768 soldiers behind at Isandlwana Hill. The result was that Chelmsford's main force would be 15 miles away, unable to assist the reserve force if they were attacked. On the following morning of January 22nd, Lord Chelmsford left about half of his army at Isandlwana under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline. who at this point had a total of 1,768 men in the camp, it having also been reinforced by Durnford's reserves. The camp at Isandlwana had 891 Europeans. 600 of these soldiers wore the famous British redcoats, and 877 African native levies. The army left at Isandlwana consisted of 5 companies of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment, 1 company of the 2nd of 24th, 2 pieces of artillery and a rocket battery, 34 men of Dartnell's Natal Mounted Police, 3 companies of the 3rd Natal Native Contingent, 1 squadron of mounted troops and some Natal Native volunteers. Colonel Henry Pauline was left in charge of Isandlwana with orders to hold the camp, though no one actually expected it to be attacked. Then Chelmsford and Colonel Glenn rode out of Isandlwana and headed in the direction of Halakazi to meet up with Dartnell. Chelmsford force arrived at Dartnell's camp at 6:30 in the morning. Over the next few hours, they pursued dispersing bands of Zulus further and further away from Pauline and the garrison at Isandlwana. Throughout the day, various reports reached them from Isandlwana, hints that it was under attack. Nevertheless, Chelmsford remained convinced no serious danger threatened Isandlwana. By 2 p.m., he still remained unaware of the danger to his rear. Chelmsford made a fatal mistake by failing to recognize the Zulus' ability to plan such a tactical triumph. On January 20th, Colonel Durnford's force had been ordered to remain at Rorke's Drift to prevent Zulus from entering the colony of Natal. That evening, a portion of the No. 2 column under Durnford arrived at Rorke's Drift and camped on the Zulu bank, where it remained through the next day. Then, to reinforce Isandlwana camp defenses, Chelmsford sent an order to Colonel Anthony Durnford, who was still at Rorke's Drift, to march his contingent of 526 men to the camp for extra support. Around 10:30 a.m. on the morning of January 22nd, Durnford arrived at Isandlwana from Rorke's Drift with 5 troops of the Natal Native Horse and a rocket battery. Colonel Durnford was superior in rank to Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline, who had been left in control of the camp. This put the issue of command in question because Durnford had received the rank of colonel before Pauline, and by tradition would have assumed command. Durnford did not overrule Pauline's command, however, and after lunch, he quickly decided to take the initiative and move forward to engage a Zulu force which Pauline and Durnford judged to be moving against Chelmsford's rear. Durnford asked for a company of the 24th, but Pauline was reluctant to agree since his orders had been specifically to defend the camp. While Chelmsford's main army column was slowly plodding its way towards the Zulu King's kraal, that is village, Cetshwayo's Zulu warriors had bypassed Chelmsford's main force and ran like Spartans towards Isandlwana to astonish the British with a surprise attack. The warriors split into groups that went around both sides of Isandlwana in an attempt to surround the British and make sure that no one escaped alive. The main Zulu force was discovered around 11 a.m. by the men of Lieutenant Raw's troop of scouts that had chased a number of Zulus into a valley. When they looked over the ridge and peered into the Ngwabeni Valley, they were horrified to see 24,000 men of the main Zulu impi, that is army, sitting in total silence. Having been discovered, the Zulu force leapt to their feet with a deafening roar, and they raced toward Raw's men. The troopers retreated back to camp and warned Pauline at 12:15 in the afternoon. The trap had been set, and the famous Battle of Isandlwana was about to be launched into history with a rapid and intense ferocity. The main Zulu attack began at 12:30, with 20,000 men and 4,000 warriors being held in reserve. At first, the British line comprised mainly of the 1st and 24th Regiments, held firm with the 2 cannons keeping a steady fire. However, as many as a third of the Zulus were armed with some type of firearm, which eventually began to take its toll, and the warriors advanced to within 800 meters of the somewhat extended British line, due to a shortage of men who had also begun to run short of ammunition. A simultaneous partial eclipse of the sun during the fighting added an airy quality to the battle. The natives employed their usual, well-organized method of attack, being formed into a figure roughly resembling that of a beast, with horns, chest, and loins. A feint is generally made with one horn, while the other, under the cover of a hill or brush, sweeps round to encircle the enemy. The vast chest then advances and crushes the foe. The loins are left a little distance behind, ready to join in pursuit where necessary. It was the left horn of Cetshwayo's army that was held in check by Colonel Durnford. The chest or main body became engaged with the force at the camp, and the right horn was swinging round the hills, racing to surround the camp at the rear of Isandlwana. Steadily, remorselessly, the MP closed in. They were a hungry sea of Zulus with overwhelming strength. Then followed the ghastly butchery. With short stabbing assegais, the naked savages rushed straight on, treading underfoot those in their own ranks who were shot. Mercy was neither expected nor granted during that horrific scene of slaughter. The disastrous battle of Isandlwana was in full swing when a rider on a spent horse galloped into Chelmsford's camp with the following message: "For God's sake, come with all your men. The camp is surrounded and will be taken unless helped." Fighting like demons, a party of men from the 24th Regiment, the Natal Mounted Police, and volunteers rallied round Colonel Durnford and held their ground gallantly. In one last valiant effort, Durnford, after ordering his native troopers to escape, perished with a mixed group of colonial volunteers, members of the Natal Mounted Police, and infantrymen of the 24th Foot, after they had held apart the horns of the Zulu army long enough to enable many survivors to escape. As the final rush came, Colonel Durnford clearly saw that death was inevitable for nearly everyone. He shouted to the Natal Mounted Police and volunteers nearby, "Get away as best you can," but very few heard or obeyed him. Practically nothing is known of what happened in that awful few minutes at the finish, for the Zulus were not very communicative on the subject for many years afterwards. The actions of Durnford and his command effectively halted the left horn of the Zulu army until their cartridge boxes became empty. This was no small accomplishment, considering the left horn included the Ngobamakhosi Regiment, the Benders of the Kings. With their ammunition supply expended, Durnford and his troopers fought their way back to the saddle that separated the wagon park from the rest of the camp. Durnford's body was later found lying near a wagon, surrounded by the bodies of his men. By about 3 p.m., the British position had been overrun, and those who tried to escape the slaughter attempted to flee via the saddle between Isandlwana and Black's Kopje. Most of these fugitives were stopped by the Zulu's right horn, and only a few on horseback got away. Meloga Zulu was one of the Zulu warrior chiefs who commanded part of the Zulu army at Isandlwana, made the following statement: "We were fired on first by the mounted men, who checked our advance for some little time. The rest of the Zulu regiments became engaged with the soldiers, who were in skirmishing order. When we pressed on, the mounted men retired to a donga, where they stopped us, and we lost heavily from their fire. As we could not drive them out, we extended our horn to the bottom of the donga, the lower part crossing and advancing onto the camp in a semicircle. When the mounted men saw this, they galloped out of the donga to the camp. The main body of the Zulus then closed in. The soldiers were massing together. All this time the mounted men kept up a steady fire and kept going farther into the camp. The soldiers, when they got together, fired at a fearful rate, but all of a sudden stopped, divided, and some started to run. We did not take any notice of those who ran, thinking that the end of our horn would catch them, but pressed on to those who remained. They got into and under the wagons and fired, but we killed them all at that part of the camp. When we closed in, we came onto a mixed party of mounted men and infantry, who had evidently been stopped by the horn. They numbered about 100, and made a desperate resistance, some firing with pistols and others using swords. I heard the command "Fire!" but we proved too many for them, and killed them all where they stood. When it was all over, I had a look at these men, and saw an officer with his arm in a sling and with a big mustache. That was Colonel Durnford. He was surrounded by carbineers, soldiers, and other men I did not know, encircled by the bodies of his men. We ransacked the camp and took away everything we could, including some ammunition which we got out of boxes. Before the warriors finally closed around the doomed men, a rush was made by those who could escape in the direction of the Buffalo River. These were followed by a section of Zulus who hacked the fugitives as they ran. Of the 34 members of the Natal Mounted Police who had been left at the camp by Major Dartnell, only 9 escaped. The bodies of 3 were found a couple of hundred yards away, and 1 was lying in Fugitives' Drift. The members of the Natal police force who were killed at Cetshwayo were Corporal Lally, Lance Corporal Campbell, and Troopers Banger, Berry, Blakeman, Capps, J. Clark, Daniels, Dory, Eason, Fletcher, Lloyd, McRae, Mears, Neal, Pierce, Parsons, Pollard, Playdell, F. Secretan, Siddall, Stimson, Thick, C. White, and Winkle. The men who escaped were Lance Corporal Eaton, Trumpeter Stevens, and Troopers Collier, Doig, Dorhill, W. Hayes, died of fever at Helpmacar, Kincaid, Shannon, and Sparks. So sharp and terrible had been the onslaught that the police who survived were unable to say much about the last scenes. They had been sent out with all the mounted men to hold the main Zulu army in check, which they did until their ammunition was exhausted. Messengers galloped back frantically for more cartridges, but did not return, so the whole body retired when they ran out of ammunition. Later, they found out that the messengers had found the cartridges tightly screwed up in boxes that they could not open without screwdrivers. The practice of screwing down the lids was abolished when the news of this incident reached England. When Colonel Durnford realized that the battle was lost, he had told the men to leave him and save themselves as best they could. It was clear that the men could have escaped by jumping on their horses, which stood nearby, and rode back to the supply camp at Rorke's Drift, but they chose to stay with Durnford in a desperate attempt to cover the right flank of the doomed camp. At Cetshwayo, the Natal Mounted Police had the distinct honor of having made the last stand, with Colonel Durnford fighting till their death on the ridge where the dead men lay. A large proportion of them wore the uniform of the Natal Mounted Police. In a patch of long grass near the right flank of the camp lay Colonel Durnford's body, a central figure of a knot of brave men who had fought it out around their chief to the bitter end. He was surrounded by 14 carbineers and 21 Natal Mounted Police. One of the most memorable episodes at the end of the battle concerns Lieutenants Melville and Coghill. Melville was the adjutant of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Foot. Near the end of the battle, he was ordered to save the Queen's color, so he collected it from the guard tent, left camp, and rode towards the Buffalo River. When Melville arrived at the river, it was in flood stage from the rains. He and his horse plunged in, but halfway across, Melville came off his horse, still clutching to the flag. Melville was struggling for his life in the swift current when the Queen's flag slipped out of his hand and floated down the river. Lieutenant Coghill, also of the 24th Foot, crossed the river soon after and went to Melville's assistance. The Zulus were, by this time, lining the bank and opened a heavy fire on the 2 officers. Coghill's horse was killed, and the color swept away again. Both officers struggled to the Natal bank, where it seems likely that they were killed by local Natal natives. Melville and Coghill probably died at around 3:30 p.m. The battle had raged for less than an hour. Chelmsford's force of some 1,768 men were slaughtered. Less than 100 managed to escape before the Zulus encircled them. 72% of the men that Lord Chelmsford had left at Isandlwana were wiped out. The Zulus had numerous superstitious beliefs about the human body. Because the human body is inhabited with spirits, certain ceremonies had to be carried out after their death. They noticed that a dead body left unattended would swell up in the belly. They believed that this was a sign of the spirit desperately trying to release itself from the corpse. In order to prevent this tragedy, the Zulus believed the body of a dead person had to be disemboweled. This meant making an incision across the body's abdomen and removing its entrails. As you can imagine, the Zulus left behind a battle scene of tremendous horror. Chelmsford's column advanced to the dreadful scene at Isandlwana and camped near the battlefield where the bodies of their fellow soldiers lay moldering in the tall, dry grass. Not a Zulu was seen, and the force moved up to the place where dead men only were encamped. Stumbling over the bodies of white men and natives in the darkness, they made their way awe-stricken to the ridge. Every man was exhausted with the continual marching and lack of food, and they lay down weary and distraught amidst the debris of the plundered camp and the mangled corpses of men and horses. It was a night of horror. The men who lived through it do not care to recall the memory. Bright fires were seen in the distance, so the horses were not unsaddled, but were put in a ring, and stood uneasily all night with the bodies of dead men lying around them. Natal Police Colonel Clark wrote in his diary, "I had charge of 30 of the horses during part of the night. 4 corpses of the 24th Regiment lay in the ring, and other bodies under the horses' legs, which caused the animals to frantically surge to and fro so that it was near impossible to control them. There were several false alarms with some firing in the middle of the night. Someone found a commissariat wagon and called out, 'Roll up for biscuits,' but there was no response from anyone. The night seemed endless. But at break of dawn we were able to realize the horrors of our situation. Mutilated bodies were lying everywhere, some naked, some only in shirts, and nearly all without boots. The Zulus had done their plundering very thoroughly. Most of the fallen men were disemboweled, but the members of the Natal Mounted Police had been killed with only 1 or 2 stabs. Everything in the camp was broken. Sacks of mealies is corn, and oats were ripped open, tins of bully beef were stabbed, bottles were broken, and tents destroyed. Even the wagons had been overturned into dongas, that is, ravines, in the mad carnival of wrecking. Both sides lost heavily in the Battle of Isandlwana. Approximately 3,000 Zulu warriors were also killed. At this news, King Cetshwayo said, "Alas, a spear has been thrust into the belly of the nation." Chelmsford was staggered when he saw the grisly scene that had been left by the Zulus. He said, "But I left a strong force here. How was this possible?" In the distance, the British could see that their reserve army supply dump at Rorke's Drift was on fire. Lord Chelmsford was horrified when he realized that the Zulus had already crossed the Buffalo River into British territory, and the whole colony of Natal was in grave danger. After Chelmsford's monumental disaster at Isandlwana, he asked Major Dartnell and his Natal Mounted Police to cover his army's retreat back to Natal Colony. All the Natal Mounted Police killed at the disaster of Isandlwana died heroes' deaths. On the 30th of June, 1879, the Natal Mercury newspaper wrote the following commendation about the Natal Mounted Police. "There is one branch of army that is now spreading itself over our frontiers and over Zululand, to which scant justice has been done in the records of this campaign. It is a force which, to us in Natal, ought to, and we believe does, possess particular interest, for it represents the future army of Natal and the contribution of Natal in some approaching time to the future army of South Africa. We refer to the Natal Mounted Police. That body occupies a peculiar position. It is not imperial in any sense of the term, although the government which has created it owns the supremacy of the Queen. It has played an effective and very honorable part in the imperial campaign. It consists in the main of men recruited in England, and although there are amongst its ranks several colonists, its ranks are from time to time filled up by men who have enrolled themselves at home. Only the other day, over 60 such additions came to fill up the gap left by the cruel losses at Isandlwana. We have always felt it both a pleasure and a duty to uphold the reputation of Major Dartnell's force, and we do so the more heartily now, because it has during the eventful and trying times of the last 6 months earned every right to be regarded with respect and admiration. That the men played the part of true soldiers at Isandlwana, the bodies of their slain comrades grouped around the last rallying point sadly testify. The records of the campaign show that whenever their services have been called into action, they have behaved with gallantry and distinction. This is no more than we might have expected of any corps led by Major Dartnell, than whom we believe a more devoted, daring, and yet discreet leader will not be found in South Africa. The trumpet of fame has not sounded their praises, but that is due to circumstances rather than to attention. Whatever the Natal Mounted Police have had to do, they have done it well, and the fine young fellows who have come out to join its ranks may take just pride to themselves in thinking that they belong to a force that enjoys in an especial degree the appreciation of the community they serve. The Corps must and will be our chief defense force of the future. What we want in Natal is a mobile, effective body of men ready on short notice to operate at any point where insurrectionary tendencies display themselves, and such a body we have in the Natal Police. The Battle of Isandlwana stunned the world. It was unthinkable that a native army armed substantially with stabbing weapons could defeat troops of a Western power armed with modern rifles, rockets, and artillery, let alone wipe it out. It was very fortunate for Chelmsford that even though the Zulus had thoroughly defeated the British army at Isandlwana, King Cetshwayo did not seek revenge, but still wished to minimize the war instead of capitalizing on his victory by entering Natal and defeating the enemy that had come to defeat him. General Sir Garnet Wolseley was sent to replace Lord Chelmsford for the disaster at Isandlwana, but Chelmsford was again fortunate that Wolseley did not arrive until after the final battle of the Zulu War had been won. This is the end of Episode 3. Please proceed to Episode 4, The Miraculous Stand at Rorke's Drift.